Welcome everyone. I thought that I would make this short video to welcome you back and to try and give some sense of continuity within the course. As you're aware, we're not able to meet in person for some time to come, so this video is an attempt to at least keep some of the ideas in mind as we move forwards. It's been produced on QuickTime on a Mac. You can, I believe, read it on Windows 12. That should be able to decode this file type. So I'm hoping that everybody will be able to see this video and to gain something from it. Moving forwards, what I'll do is to maintain connection with the readings that we've been speaking about. There are two more readings I'd like to look at. So that's chapter 5 of Jeanette, and then the final chapter from Cobley. Cobley is the assigned course text, so if you don't already have a copy of the second edition of Cobley, I would suggest ordering one, since we'll refer directly to that, and I'm not sure that the School of Music Library actually owns one. I know that Carl has one, perhaps both of Mandy and also Alison also have them now, but we will need to see them, and I will have PDFs of some things, but not PDFs of everything, particularly if we don't have that book in the School of Music Library. It's pretty much impossible to make one by this point, I think. So do purchase a copy of Cobley. But what I want to do now, and I'll try and segment this, as this seems to be the best advice for making an instructional video, is to offer some comments on the Brahms song, Opus 43, number 1. That's von ewiger Liebe, that we listened to and thought about through the article by Rick Cohn just before we ended prior to spring break. So I'm going to go back to the map that I put together, principally relating to Roland Barthes, but also to consider some of the other texts that we've been reading. Here it is in front of the screen now. So everyone has a copy of this. And what I'd like to do is to add detail that helps to interpret the song in the context of this particular map. So there it is. Hopefully you can pick out your copy. We can think about annotating that. So I'll just hold it up in front of the screen for a little while longer so you can refresh your memory as to what it looks like, and then I'll begin to talk about it in 2 or 3 segments. So here's the first segment. So if we look at the way the map is set out, we spoke about it between the extreme left. There is a sense of a message which is conveyed from a narrator to a reader. And that's certainly how the song seems to work in the approach that Brahms has taken to it. So let's try and break it down in terms of what Brahms actually does in responding to the poem. We remember that the poem has no actual author. It was a folk poem and then put into a versified form by a German contemporary of Brahms, but obviously Brahms was attracted to this particular verse for some reason, and there are probably biographical reasons for that, as we've suggested. But let's try and look in detail at the map now. So on the left, as I say, narrator, and underneath that I set out where I think the story or fabula plane is. And then we contrast that with the discourse or the sujet plane, which is lower right, as opposed to upper left, story, fabula. And also that would take care of where the plot is located. So under story and fabula, that seems to be the place where we talk about agency. In other words, the characters in the narrative, but what the Greeks would call, in their particular term, prosopopeia. And in this case, those agents are 2. There's the youth and there's the maiden. So that would be the protagonist and the antagonist, as Hillis Miller calls them. The location, well, it's not specific, but we do get some information that actually gives us a feel for where this particular confrontation is taking place. The location is an undefined rural setting. It's close to the forest, but it's away from the town. Okay, so that sets up what I think is the first stage of this video, and so I'll move to the second stage in a second. I'll just allow a little time in case you're taking notes from what I'm saying. Okay, so let's move to consider discourse. So this will be phase 2. Barthes says that across any narrative, we find that different layers gradually collect into indices. And those indices are formed around the cardinal nuclei. So the cardinal nuclei are pretty much in the middle of the map as I assembled it. The indices and seem to be best mapped out by thinking about the way they cross levels. So they are arranged in a kind of vertical stack or a column. So let's consider them first of all from a musical point of view. Essentially, the trope we're thinking of, the literary figure, is metaphor, things that are similar to one another. We spoke about that in class. In music, these cardinal nuclei that form the indices would be the pitch centers of the music. The music is essentially in tonic major, tonic minor in B. So its cardinal nuclei, its indices in pitch terms around B, minor, major. But it's also apparent from Cohen's article that the rhythmic pathways are significant. And those rhythmic pathways here seem to be best collected together through a set of different divisions or demarcations of a single ultimate span pulse. That span pulse is the dotted whole note, which is, I think, 36 times larger than the smallest note value that would act as a common denominator. So that is the ultimate rhythmic metaphorical equivalence. Everything is a subset or segment of that. But then we can think about the text. The text has its own cardinal nuclei, which form indices across multiple levels. They would be, for instance, the primary states of mind that we find from the agents. The two main agents, the protagonist, the youth, is very nervous and hyperactive, whereas the antagonist, the maiden, is much more assertive and self-confident. Compare then the narrator, who seems to be neutral, who takes neither side and has no particular role to play, but clearly frames the story as we find it. And therefore we could consider him, or perhaps if it's sung by a female singer, her, to carry the role of a cardinal nucleus, again helping to form associations across multiple levels. But Barthes says that obviously time is also important, and that he sees those nuclei as essentially static unless they are metonymically unfolded across time. So this is achieved through a set of catalyzing links. In Brahms's terms, that means, yes, the rhythmic characterizations of the different time signatures, 3, 4, and the way that it's treated in a kind of hemiolar fashion, the conflicts between rhythmic subdivisions of the span pulse, and then ultimately the shift to 6/8, which is itself still part of a kind of conflicted field towards the end of the song. But it's also to do with the prelude to the music and the postlude, and the fact that between the youth and the maiden there is an interlude. So these facets of the music where no texted enunciation is apparent are also part of the temporal flow. But Barthes says, yes, at the same time, that flow is not always smooth. It involves, as we have here, not just elements of sequence, but also of deviation. And that could be between odd and even hypermeters, a grouping of measures into 2 and 4 bar units, and dystaxia, in other words, points of friction. Here, the tonal trajectory, which Cohen says is between a sort of dominant association of one time division, dominant to the dominant of another, and a shift towards a quasi-subdominant subdivision. But it's always the narrator who seems to draw us back to a 3-2 overwriting of the 3-4 sequence. And this is something that Cohen misses. He misses that association prior to stanza 3 when the maiden sings. So I think that's the second part of the video. So I'll just pause here if you want to take in some of those thoughts. And then we'll move to a section to deal with meaning. So, section 3. Meaning is, in part, what the maiden brings to this particular tale, the sense of assertiveness and confidence. This is what Hillis Miller refers to the reversal of fortune, not now negative, but positive. But the word we're looking for here is peripeteia. So I would say that's located above the sort of functions and metonymy sense that is there inscribed on the map. But peripateia is part of the meaning, the shift in meaning. But that meaning is not itself altogether uniform. For instance, we think about the levels of time that we thought about in the reading from Paul Ricoeur, taken from Martin Heidegger. The three layers of time are quite clear in this song, I think. The very beginning seems to be a kind of primordial, unbroken sense of temporal continuum. It could be at any point, even prior to human habitation on the land. The sense of everyday time is the youth, the sense that things are quickly formed and quickly broken. His nerve fails and he has no more to say. But it's the maiden who really points towards history. She argues they should stay together. She has, in other words, the essence of what Ricoeur, reading Heidegger, believes is the nature of history. Care, yes, grounded in the past, but also live and active towards the future. Through their union, life can continue. But it's not until we examine the tension between story and discourse that we understand how deep laid that history is. And this is pointed up by the relationship, as we noted in class, between the barcarolle, which is a Venetian gondolier's song, and the fact that it sets words which refer to iron and steel, in other words, an industrial future. That tension, that contradiction is what we've discovered through people like Jonathan Culler, the tension between story and discourse. But I argued that we can resolve it if we think about Brahms's biographical circumstances. So to the right, underneath where the reader's position is, and by the way, in this case, it's also the listener, we are the witness who learns, in Miller's terms. It's the listener's role to understand this and to interpret it. We understand best if we think about the relationship between Brahms's parents. His mother was a seamstress. She was called Johanna Niesen. She lived 1789 to 1865. His father was a musician, and not a particularly good one, called Johann Brahms. He lived 1806 to 72. They were married in 1830. Brahms himself was then born 3 years later. He was born in 1833 and died in 1897. But they lived in Hamburg, and he also understood that his mother, I think 17 years older than his father, was the person who really held the household together. So my argument was that you can better resolve the sense of story and discourse if you understand the fact that this is a biographical reference Brahms is making. It's not just to what you see in the poem, but you also have to move outwards to pan out into the actual lived experience that Brahms himself had. What about this association of story and discourse? Again, is there a gap? Is there a tension? There could be. And I know that Carl would want me to speak about the complex word. So here's my best guess as to what the complex word is. We'll remember that Hillis Miller spoke about the complex word as bringing together the contradictions in a single term. It needn't be part of the poem. It could be a word that is implied by the poem, in this case, implied by the song. One candidate for the complex word could therefore be rhythm. Rhythm could be the complex word. It has all of those multifaceted features about it. They don't quite seem to actually resolve. This was Cohen's point when he saw the tension as maintained and ultimately not resolved, but dissolved. But if our argument is correct, and that Brahms is on the side of women's contribution to history moving forwards, much as at the same time he sees that as an industrialized future, as he would living in Hamburg and seeing ships come in and out of port, ships of different kinds of mechanical, not just wind-powered trajectory, then perhaps we have to take a word and project forwards in time. So here is my suggestion. The complex word for this song is actually history. complex word is history, but we can't understand why it is a complex word until we break it down into two parts. In other words, his story is better understood from Brahms as her story. And so perhaps we introduce another rift between story and discourse, that in finding meaning, it's almost as though we have to transport from the middle of the 19th century to the 1970s in the context of American feminism, which actually did place this kind of slogan on the placard and actually see it as an affirmative statement about the place of women in the world moving forwards. So although story and discourse here seems to find a very convincing association, perhaps that association in the end is something that's more appropriate to us in a contemporary sense than it could have been to Brahms in his own time. Okay, I'll stop there. I'll hope that this file isn't too enormous to be able to put into an email, and I'll also send a backup email, if not tomorrow, perhaps on Tuesday, Wednesday, to set up some reading moving forwards. Okay, thank you very much. I know this is not high budget production, filmed here in my home office as the light is fading, but hopefully you'll gain something from it. Okay, thanks.